Okay. So we left off talking about vigilance last time, and I did show you this article. And here's where it says, by the way, that most of the brain regions in this meta-analysis involved with vigilance were right lateralized, which is kind of an idea in the master and his emissary, which is emphasized. So here's an article published in Psychological Bulletin, which is a journal with a very high impact factor, which agrees with this idea that the right hemisphere seems to be more involved than the left for vigilant attention, which is also known as open attention. Just to kind of refresh, reminding ourselves that last time we were talking about these studies with chickens, the dual task studies, and they had these two tasks that they were performing simultaneously. The so-called vigilance task was using an eye to look out for predators, while the more selective attention task was trying to find the food grains. Okay, so moving on. So I mentioned last time that we are going to kind of wrap up this chapter talking about some kind of difficult studies, some kind of difficult concepts related to attention. If I recall, most of these studies we're going to talk about are still about visual attention, which is most of the studies in this chapter are about visual attention. So we'll start out here. This is a fMRI study, and they're looking at how does the brain change depending on where in space you are paying attention to. So this is a study. I think I actually have a picture of the stimuli they were looking at later on. So let's go ahead and jump to that. Yeah, they were looking at something like this in this study. They were looking at the fixation cross, and they were made to pay attention to either the left visual field or they were paying attention to the right visual field. And they were looking to see what regions of the brain became activated depending on the visual field to which you were attending. So it was a visual attention task. And so one place you would probably kind of focus your analysis would be over the visual cortex, which is in the occipital lobe here in the back of the brain. So that's where they focus their analysis in this study. And so right here, these are kind of the results of the study. And one of the things that makes these kind of figures a tiny bit confusing is down here, there's additional information, which is just anatomical markings. So like, once again, these are the activations in the study, the fMRI activations, the place where there was high blood flow in the various conditions. Down here, this green, yellow, blue, and red, these are actually just anatomical markings to provide the viewer the anatomical locations of these different visual areas, V1, V2, VP. I never remember what VP stands for, and V4, but these are all visual areas, part of visual cortex. Primary visual cortex, you can see, is kind of up top in the occipital lobe, so it's a little bit higher, whereas these other visual regions are relatively inferior to V1. That is, they're below V1, below primary visual cortex. And kind of the question which is addressed in this study is, it's a visual attention study, which areas of visual cortex does the activity change as a result of attention? Is V1 the region where there's a lot of attentional modulation, or is it V2, V4? Is it the really early regions like V1, or is it the more later regions like V2 and V4? And so we look here, and there's a couple things. These are the, once again, these are the regions where there was activation depending on which visual field the people were attending to. And so first thing to notice is, this is not particularly surprising. When people were attending to the left visual field, there was relatively more activation in the right hemisphere of the brain. This is consistent with what we've been talking about, kind of the contralateral organization, where things in the left side of the world tend to be processed in the right hemisphere of the brain. Kind of an analogous thing over here. When you're attending to the right visual field, there tends to be more activation in the left hemisphere. So this first slide, though, the thing I kind of want to point out is exactly which of those visual regions tend to be activated. We know that the contralateral hemisphere tends to be activated, but particularly which visual regions in the overall visual cortex and the overall occipital lobe tend to be most strongly activated, depending on whether you're paying attention to something or whether you are not paying attention to something. And kind of the headline here is that attentional modulations tends to be bigger in later visual regions. And in particular, I want to point out that V1, once again, V1 is this green area right here, which is kind of superior. It's kind of at the top of the occipital lobe. It would be about right here. And over here on this one, it would be about right here. So this is a study that showed that V1, which is the earliest visual region, was not modulated by attention. When people were paying attention, activity in primary visual cortex, V1, was the same as when people were not paying attention. The strongest modulation in the visual cortex occurred about right here. And they have that's what this little black outline thing is right here. Notice how this black outline thing here matches this outline right here, and that this black outline thing here matches this outline here. This is where the most activation was found in the occipital lobe. This right here was where the most amount of activation was found on the occipital lobe. And please notice how these markings do not overlap at all with the green stuff up here. The green stuff is visual cortex, primary visual cortex, the earliest cortical area where visual information is processed. And so what this suggests is that, so it looks like V4 in that VP area, those inferior parts of the occipital lobe. Once again, the red is V4, the blue VP, maybe a little bit of V2, which is the yellow. These are relatively later visual regions, later relative to primary visual cortex, or V1. Those are the regions that receive the most, have the most amount of enhanced activation as a result of attention. So it's not everything in the visual cortex which is modulated by attention. It tends to be the later brain regions. And there's a couple small exceptions in the textbook, but this is kind of one of the bigger picture themes of this chapter. They even present a theory in this chapter, which basically suggests that when you're paying attention to something, the parts of your brain which are enhanced the most by attention tend to be the later regions of the brain, not the super early visual regions like V1. Later visual regions tend to be enhanced more by attention than earlier ones. It's kind of an overall theme of this chapter, although there's a couple exceptions. I think I'll actually present another study here in a second, which kind of supports the same idea that there's really not very much attentional modulation in V1. V1 seems to be basically a kind of a vertical, representation of whatever it is out in the world. And the enhancement, depending on whether you're attending to something or not, is in different brain regions, not V1. I have more evidence in support of that in a second. This study right here, in fact, which is based on the biased competition model. And I'll kind of go to the punchline first, but then we'll work backwards and I'll kind of explain how this study, which this is a kind of complicated study, supports this idea that there's more attentional enhancement in V4 than there is in V1. And so the key thing about this biased competition model is that right here, this point right here, attentional effects are biggest when there is competition. In the study that we're looking at here, the competition comes in this condition right here known as the simultaneous condition. It's a simultaneous condition because there's 4 different pictures presented on the screen at the same time. And your job as the participant is to attend to one of them. On any given trial, the researcher would give you some kind of cue, which would tell you specifically, pay attention to one of these, which simultaneously requires you kind of have to ignore the other ones. That's the simultaneous condition, because all of the pictures are presented at the same time. Contrasting that with the sequential condition, in the sequential condition, each one of these pictures is presented by itself. You're still told to focus in on one of them, but you notice how when each picture appears, it appears by itself. And so when a given picture occurs, there's nothing that you have to inhibit. There's nothing that you have to ignore. So that's the crucial difference between these two conditions. There's competition from the other pictures here for when you're paying attention to that one target picture. But in the sequential condition, there is no competition because each picture is presented by itself. So we'll move on and look at the data from this study. So there's a lot going on here. So here, right here, the top row, this is V1. This represents, so the signal change basically means like fMRI response or bold response, just the amount of activity in the given brain region. V1 means primary visual cortex. V4 means visual area 4. This is the relatively later visual part of the brain, is later relative to V1. And so they're looking at activation in these two brain regions under several different conditions. And so the left side right here, they just call this sensory interactions. And what they mean here is that here you're just kind of passively viewing the different pictures. Once again, there's the sequential, which is right here, and then simultaneous, and then sequential. So I don't want you to forget what those are. The sequential is this thing where there's no competition. You see each picture for 250 milliseconds by itself compared to simultaneous when you see all four pictures for 250 milliseconds, but at the same time. Sequential, it's each picture by itself. The simultaneous, you're seeing all the pictures at the same time, and then sequential again right here. In this left column, sensory interactions, the participant is not told to pay attention to any specific picture. They're kind of just passively viewing the pictures, and they're looking at what happens to brain activity how is brain activity different between when you're looking at each picture by itself compared to when you're looking at all of the pictures at the same time. And the answer is in V1, there is no difference. In V1, basically all of those, the brain activity in V1 is the same, depending on whether you're seeing each picture by itself or you're seeing all of the pictures at the same time. In V4, on the other hand, you can see these arrows pointing to a reduction. And that's because you can see that these peaks right here, this is the amount of activation in V4, these peaks are relatively lower than these peaks on the other side. So this peak right here is from the sequential condition. This peak right here is also from the sequential condition. The sequential condition is when each picture is presented by itself, when there is no competition. When there is competition, such as in the simultaneous condition right here, there is a reduction in the activity in V4. So in V4, when there's a lot of clutter, when there's a lot of stuff going on in a visual scene, that can actually reduce the amount of activity in V4 compared to when there's just one thing in a scene. But remember, these are just the sensory interactions conditions. So this is when people are not focusing on anything in particular. The main purpose of this study was to understand how does the brain activity change when people are told to focus in on a specific picture. So we'll go back. This is what this is. These blue stripes right here, these are when participants were told to focus in specifically on one picture. And so here they're focusing in on one specific picture in the simultaneous condition, that is when all the pictures are presented at the same time. And here they are focusing in on one picture in the sequential condition when each picture is presented by itself. And once again, though, you can see that there's no difference. These peaks right here, these are the same height as these over here. And so they're paying attention in where the blue vertical stripes are, but you can see where the blue vertical stripes are, the height of these curves is the same as the height of the curves over here where there are no blue stripes. These are not significant differences in the height. So what this suggests is that, at least in this study, there's no evidence that when you're paying attention to something that changes the signal in V1 at all. The strength of the signal in V1 in this study is the same whether you're paying attention to something or whether you are not paying attention to something. No significant differences between the white area right here and the blue areas right here. However, there's a different story in V4. V4, once again, these blue vertical lines, these are where people are paying attention to a single stimulus in the array of a single picture out of all of the different pictures. And a crucial comparison is this one right here. So in the simultaneous condition, when you're paying attention to one picture compared to the simultaneous picture, the simultaneous condition when you are not told to pay attention to any specific thing. Here you are paying attention to one specific picture. Here you're just told to passively view the pictures. You can see that there's an enhancement in the activation in V4. And you can see that because there's a difference in the height of these two bars. And this bar is taller than this one. When you're paying attention to something, the activity in V4 increases. There was no difference for V1, but there was a difference for V4. But please note that this is in the simultaneous condition. Remember, the simultaneous condition was when there was competition. there was something that you had to ignore in the simultaneous condition. There was something that you had to inhibit. And if we look at the sequential condition, when each picture was presented by itself, here the proper comparison is comparing this blue bar, the curve by the blue bar, to this one over here, comparing these two things right here. And you can see these two things are the same height. When people are paying attention to a specific picture in the sequential condition, the amount of activity in V4 is the same as the amount of activity in V4 when you're not told to pay attention to anything. So I guess there's kind of two punchlines to this. One, that V4, there tends to be more modulation, attentional modulation, than there does in V1. V4, the attentional responses are more pronounced than in V1. The other kind of punchline is that attentional modulation is strongest when there's something out in the world that you have to ignore. When things are presented by itself and there's no noise out in the world, there's no competition, there's nothing you have to ignore or inhibit, the attentional modulation in V4 is not very strong. This attentional modulation appears to be most important when there's a cluttered scene, when there's a lot going on, and you have to focus in on a specific aspect of that scene. So right here, this is kind of the crucial thing. This is V4, when in the simultaneous condition, that's when you see the most attentional modulation. Any questions or comments about this study? All right, let's move on then. So this is a related concept. It potentially could explain why, and this is something we talked about. If I recall, I actually asked you a kind of a similar question to this on test 1. A general principle in the visual system is that the receptive fields tend to be small in early visual areas, like V1. The receptive fields tend to be small. But as you go further away from V1, so V1 is in occipital lobe, you go down and then you curve around towards the temporal lobes. V1, and you kind of go down and then around towards the temporal lobes. The further away you get from primary visual cortex, in general, the receptive fields get bigger. One theory, although it is just a theory, there's some support for it, some not support for it, is that one of the primary ways that visual attention works is by reducing the way the receptive fields work, or potentially things like reducing or changing their size. So you could imagine if there's a really cluttered environment, you know, V4 receptive fields are usually pretty big. They respond to large chunks of the visual world. But one potential theory for how attentional modulation works is by taking those visual fields and kind of shrinking them, making it so that a given neuron, instead of responding to large chunks of space, responds to relatively smaller chunks of space. This could explain the fact that V4 tends to have more attentional modulation than V1, because in V1, the receptive fields are already quite small. And so you can't really make them potentially that much smaller than they already are in V1. And so in V4, though, where the receptive fields are already big, attention can have more of a profound effect by shrinking those receptive fields. They're already really big in V4 and IT, which is a later area in the temporal lobe. So you might see basically more attentional modulation in later visual areas because the receptive fields in these later visual areas are bigger. When the receptive fields are small, you don't really need much attentional enhancement. You're already getting all of the details of the visual world. So this is one theory, and then it could explain why attentional effects tend to be bigger in later visual regions. It has to do with receptive field size. Okay, so here's kind of this is a study, and it was published in Nature Neuroscience, so that's quite a good journal. Here's a study about another brain region. So we've been focusing in a lot about visual cortex, so what's going on in the occipital lobe back here. And that's what is highlighted right here. So this is that same study that I showed you earlier, but now we're going to be talking about some attentional modulation that was shown right here. This is the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. And I kind of remind you, I've shown you pictures probably in chapter 4 of kind of the way visual information travels from your eyes. So your eyes would be up here. This is a brain, obviously, and it looks like you're looking down on this person's, like on this brain. So you're looking from above the person's head. So the person's eyes would be right here. And then visual information, well, if it's over here in the left visual field, most of it would travel to the right hemisphere. And then there's the optic nerve basically takes the visual information here to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. And then that information travels on to the occipital lobe, which is right here. And we've already said in the occipital lobe, most of the attentional modulation is in later visual regions like V4 and that VP area. But there is also attentional modulation that occurs in lateral geniculate nucleus. When you're paying attention to something, the lateral geniculate nucleus, one of its main jobs is to send that information to visual cortex, where visual processing will continue, or will be where a lot of the most important aspects of visual processing will occur. And so you can kind of think of this as kind of like a, I don't know, like a guard or a gatekeeper, which kind of can make the decision. Do I want to allow the visual information from my eyes? Do I want to allow it to be sent to further brain regions for more enhanced processing or for deeper processing? And the basic idea is that when you are paying attention to something, you're basically telling your thalamus, okay, open the gate, allow the information to the visual cortex. When you are ignoring something, when you are not paying attention, that's basically telling the thalamus to close off the gate, to not allow that information to go to visual cortex for more processing. So I think, yeah, we're going to talk about a specific type of neuron, which has been found in the thalamus, actually two different types of neurons. And because this adds a layer of complexity, and we're looking here at, at the micro scale. Most of the time in this class, we're looking at kind of the regions as a whole. But for this particular figure right here, we're actually looking at individual neurons. So we're back at the micro scale just temporarily for this one study, this one set of graphs right here. And we're looking at two different types. So these are lateral geniculate nucleus neurons. So this is part of the thalamus. This is another part of the thalamus too, thalamic reticular neurons. So these are two different types of neurons. They're both in the thalamus, and they both are an important part of that gatekeeper mechanism that I was talking about. They're both an important part of your brain's decision. Do I allow the information to go past to get to visual cortex, or am I going to prevent that information from going further? Both of these types of neurons play an important role in this gatekeeper mechanism of attention. The LGNP neuron shown here would be considered excitatory. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So attend in versus attend out. There's basically, this means that the dark green trace right here, this is when you're paying attention to something. And then the dotted line is when you're not paying attention to something. How does this neuron change depending on whether you're paying attention to something or not paying attention to something? And if you see, maybe not that surprising, in the attend in condition, when you're paying attention to the thing, this LGNP neuron shows more spikes per second than when you're not paying attention to a thing. So that's not too surprising. More activity when you're paying attention to something compared to when you're not paying attention to something. However, the opposite is what goes on down here for the TRN neuron, thalamic reticular neuron. Basically, the exact opposite happens. You could see here that when in the attend in condition, when you're paying attention to the thing, there's actually a temporary point in time. So this is like a 30-second window or so, where there's actually less activity when you're paying attention. So the dark trace is when you're paying attention to the thing. And you can see the dark trace here is notably smaller than the dotted trace. The dotted trace is when you're not paying attention to the thing. And so you can think of these thalamic reticular neurons as inhibitory. Their main role is to prevent signals from getting to occipital cortex, from getting to the visual cortex. I think of them as like the brake on a car. And generally, when you're not paying attention to something, the brakes on the car, you're using your foot muscles to push down on the brake to prevent the car from keeping on going, or in this case, to prevent the information from getting to the visual cortex. But when you're paying attention to something, the inhibitory neurons is kind of like releasing your foot off of the brake. And what that's doing is that's allowing the visual information to get past. So when you're attending in, the response is reduced, kind of like you're taking your foot off the brake. You are instead of having the brake, using your muscle to push down on the brake, you're actually kind of relieve it. You're not using your muscles anymore. You're pulling off the brake, which allows more signals to get past you. So this idea here is that the TRN neurons are inhibitory. And so you see reduced response when you're paying attention to something. Whereas the LGNP neurons are excitatory. You see an enhanced response to them when you're attending to something compared to when you're not. Any questions or comments about the difference between these two types of neurons? All right, continue on. All right, yes, just a little bit more here. So here's an idea called feature attention. The type of attention that we've talked about mostly in this class is spatial attention. There's a lot of research on spatial attention. This is the idea that you can pay attention to either the left side of the world or the right side of the world. So you can kind of deploy your attention depending on where in space you want to pay attention to. But there are other ways that you can deploy attention other to just points in space. And the idea here is that you can deploy attention for specific features. So like you can pay attention to the color red, or you can pay attention to things that are moving. These are kind of different features that you can get your brain saying, okay, you're going to be seeing something here in the near future, and what I want you to do is find the red thing as quick as possible. And so what you're doing is you're getting your brain primed. Okay, red, you're thinking red, you're paying attention to red, so that when the scene appears that you're trying to find the red thing, your brain is ready to find the red thing as quick as possible. Or if it's, motion, you can be like, okay, I'm going to show you a scene here in a second. There'll be a lot of cluttered things on the scene. You want to find the thing which is moving. And so you're getting your brain ready. Okay, be paying attention for the thing that's moving. Ignore the things of different colors. What you really want to find here is the things which are moving. And so you're paying attention to features of objects, in this case, their color or their motion. You can also pay attention to things like shape, like, pay attention to things that are circles, ignore things that are rectangles, or vice versa. Pay attention to rectangles and ignore things which are circles. This particular study is looking at paying attention to color versus paying attention to motion. And they're looking at what parts of the brain tend to respond depending on the type of attention you are deploying, the type of feature attention you are deploying. And they were looking at these two brain regions, V4 and V5. These two regions we've talked about them a lot now. V4 is a region, it's kind of two main things that we've talked about it doing, but one of those things is it's involved in processing color. For instance, color blindness can often occur with bilateral damage to V4. V5, on the other hand, is a region of the brain that's been known to be involved with processing motion. We've talked about that way back in chapter 5, I believe, when we talked about these functions of these brain regions. And kind of the general rule, and this is another kind of big picture rule in the brain, is that when you're paying attention to something, part of the way that attention works is that it enhances those parts of the brain that normally are involved in representing the specific thing that you are paying attention to. V4 tends to represent color. So when you're paying attention to color, when you're waiting for a specific color to occur, one of the regions of the brain that is enhanced is V4, not a particularly surprising finding. Similarly, when you're waiting for something to move, when you're scanning your environment for something's moving, what you do is you start activating V5, the motion processing part of the brain. So when things start moving, you're able to respond to those things quite quickly. So it's feature-specific activation in the brain. When you're searching for something, when you're preparing to see something which is of a specific color, you kind of preemptively activate your V4, the color processing part of the brain. You do a similar thing for V5, which processes motion. Okay, and yeah, here's the object attention study. This is a challenging one for the students for whatever reason. So this is a study where I guess the reason this one's challenging is because it's really the only example of object attention that is provided in the textbook, or that we'll talk about here. I don't actually care too much about the brain findings. Students have enough trouble just understanding the concept of object attention that really I just want you to understand the behavioral findings that are presented on the left side of this. So the basic idea of object attention is that when you pay attention to like a specific part of the world, there might be an object which is in that part of the world, but the object might kind of spread beyond that specific point in space to which you're attending. The idea of object attention is that your attention kind of naturally spreads out to the entire object. You might just be paying attention to a specific point in space, and there might be part of an object there. But your idea of object attention, the tendency is for your object to actually spread around the entire object. I'm looking there, an object is there. My attention kind of naturally spreads around the object to all the points that the object is touching, even if they're not in that specific location. And that's exactly what this study shows. Behaviorally, and then it also shows the neuro aspects. But as I said, I'm mostly interested in knowing the behavioral aspects. So this arrow is a cue, and it tells you to pay attention to one of 4 parts of space. So it either tells you to pay attention to this part of space, this part of space, this part of space, or this part of space. The objects in this study are these little, to me, these look like socket wrenches or something, or wrenches. This is an object, and this is an object. And so there's different conditions. A valid trial or a valid cue is when the cue tells you, okay, pay attention to this point in space, and then a target, which, the target would be some object which occurs right here inside the circle right here. The target occurs, and your job is to respond as quickly as possible when you see the target. And so a valid trial, the arrow points to the exact location to where the target appears. Valid cue, that's the red bars. Your reaction times to respond to the target are very quick right there. But now we have another condition, an invalid cue, but the target occurs in the same object. So an invalid cue would be like, once again, the cue tells you to pay attention to right here, but then the target occurs, and the target occurs right here. So please notice that the target is occurring in the same object that you were told to originally pay attention to. You're told to pay attention to this point in space, but this point in space is connected via this object to right here. So even though you're paying attention to this point in space, the question is, does your attention naturally spread around the entire object to give you some benefits in processing targets that might appear here? And the answer is kind of a qualified yes. You can see that the green bar, it's an invalid cue, but the target is in the same object. Your reaction times are relatively slower to find a target here compared to when the target is here. But, and this is an important but, it is faster, the green bar is smaller, it is faster than this blue bar right here. So the blue bar is an invalid cue, but the target occurs in a completely different object. So that would be like the cue tells you to pay attention right here, but then the target occurs in one of these 2 dots down here. For instance, this one right here. Please note that this target right here would be the same distance from this point in space as a target that appears right here. The distance from here to here is the same as the distance from here to here. But this target right here is connected to this point in space via the object, whereas this target right here is not connected via any object. And so the question is, does the amount of time that it takes people to respond to a target here, does it differ compared to the amount of time it takes for people to respond to a target when it's presented here? And the answer appears to be yes. People were slower to respond to a target when it was presented here compared to when it was presented here. The primary difference between these 2 trials is that the target here is connected via the object, which allows reaction times to be a little faster because of object attention. Whereas here, there is no object connecting these 2 points of space. So the blue bar is the slowest response time. So that's object attention. You can ignore the stuff about the brain signals. I think it's enough just to make sure that you guys understand the behavioral findings of the study. Any questions or comments about object attention? All right. So I think, yeah, so this next stuff is just kind of fun. It's probably the easiest stuff in this entire chapter. It's purely behavioral, but it's fun. So the basic, we're now looking at a common way of studying visual attention, which is contrasting the different features of the target that you are looking for in kind of a noisy environment. So by noisy environment, I mean there's a lot of distractors. There's a lot of things in the environment that are not a target that you're looking for. There's one target that you're looking for, and kind of the question of this research on visual search is, how does the reaction time, the amount of time it takes you to find a target, how does that change depending on the characteristics of the distractors and the relationship of those characteristics to the target? So we have these two different types of situations right here. This is the main thing that I want you to understand. The difference between is a pop-out search and a conjunction search. So for a pop-out search, the target right here, it should pop out at you. It should be quite easy to see, to find what you're looking for. So in this situation, the thing that the researcher would be asking you to find, the target, would be the red O. And it's very easy to find because the target has a feature which is completely unique to it. In this case, the feature which is completely unique to the target is its color. It is the only red thing in the entire array. So the target in a pop-out search will have a feature which is unique to it. It is the only item in an entire scene which has a given feature. It has at least one completely unique feature which makes it pop out. It makes it very easy to find. If you look at the reaction times for pop-out search, you can see relative to the conjunction search, we're going to talk about in a second, the reaction times for pop-out search are small. Another thing which is interesting about pop-out search, set size basically means the amount of distractors. And for a pop-out search, it doesn't matter if there's a whole bunch of distractors or just a small amount. The thing pops out at you very quickly, and it's easy to find the target. And the task is not made harder by adding, a million distractors. That just doesn't really make things that much harder. In a pop-out search, no matter how many distractors there are in a pop-out search, the target pops out, and it's very easy to find, once again, because it has a property which is completely unique to it. Contrasting that with a conjunction search. So here we're still looking for the same target, which is the red O. But now you notice that in a conjunction search, the target does not have a feature which is completely unique to it. If you look at the distractors, it no longer has the color red unique to it, because now there are other objects, there are distractors in the scene which are also red. So it does not have that unique property of color to allow it to pop out anymore. It also does not have a unique shape property because there are other O's. So the target is not unique based on its shape, O, and it is also not unique based on its color, red. There are other O's in the array, in the scene, and there are other red things in the scene. And so it's a conjunction search. Conjunction searches are generally harder than pop-out searches. And an interesting feature of conjunction searches is that the more distractors there are, the bigger the set size, the harder the task gets, which makes sense because you kind of have to zoom in on the specific aspects of the scene, and you have to look very closely for the specific target. The more distractors there are, the more things you have to sift through, the harder it's going to be, the longer it's going to take you to find the target. So I think we have some examples of these. These are kind of fun ones. So here we're going to be looking for the color, find the K. And so you can see that the K is right here. So a question I have for you guys, is this one a pop-out search or a conjunction search? And can anyone tell me why? Is this a pop-out search or a conjunction search?
Pop-out search.
It is a pop-out search. Can you kind of justify it? Can you try and explain it?
There is only one K amongst.
Yeah, exactly. So the property of shape in this case is unique to the target. It is the only K. There is no other objects which share the property of K-ness in the entire array. So good start. Let's keep on going here. Okay, so find the gray letter. And then it's right there. So is this a pop-out search or a conjunction search?
Pop out?
It is pop-out. Can you justify that?
Because the color is unique.
Exactly. The color of gray is unique to the target. There are no other gray things here. So the color gray is completely unique to the target. Here's just another one, kind of visualizing kind of the same thing. You can see once again, because the target, the gray letter, is completely unique, the color is unique, it pops out. It's super easy to find. And it doesn't matter that there's like 40 distractors here. That's really, it just comes, it's your eye goes like straight to it because it has a property, its color, which is completely unique to it. And then here is another one. This one is like particularly easy. The target is the number 8, but this one is particularly easy because the target actually has 2 features which are completely unique to it. So one feature which is completely unique to the target, it is the only 8. The other things are S's, so it is the only thing that has the shape of 8. Can anyone tell me what the other feature which is unique to the target is? It's the only number 8, but what else is unique about it? There's another feature which is kind of unique to the target only. Let me figure this out. The 8 is the only object here which is vertical. Everything else is horizontal. So the 8 kind of has 2 things working for it, which make it very easy here. It is the only thing that has the shape of an 8, and it is also the only thing which is vertical. So it's kind of like a double pop-out search. This one's super easy because it's the only vertical thing and it's the only 8. Everything else is a horizontal S. So this has 2 features which are unique to it. Its shape and its orientation. And then finally, this one right here, the target is a horizontal 8. Please notice that here there are 2 kind of there's like 2 different characteristics that we're looking for. Its orientation, it's horizontal, and its shape, 8. So this is a dead giveaway right away that this is a conjunction search because the properties that we're looking for are a combination of 2 different features, orientation and shape. And where is this one? Horizontal 8. It is right there. And I guess that's the only horizontal 8 here. This is a conjunction search because we're looking for because this thing right here, the horizontal 8, it does not have a feature which is completely unique to it. For instance, it does not have the characteristic of 8-ness unique to it because there are other 8s. So it is not the only 8. That is not unique to the target. It is also not the only horizontal thing because that is horizontal and that is horizontal. So it does not have the feature of horizontalness that is unique to it. So finding this thing kind of requires thinking about both of these characteristics simultaneously, a conjunction of these features right here. And because none of those features are completely unique to the target, reaction times are generally longer for a conjunction search like this one. So this one's a little bit harder than the others. In theory, this would predict longer reaction times for this one compared to all the other different examples where we have pop-out searches, which were relatively easier. So that's it for lecture stuff today. I have these 3 questions, which are basically a review of everything from some of the main concepts from chapter 7. I haven't posted it yet. I'll post it like right now. This activity today's Thursday, so I'll make this due tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. on Blackboard. Type your answers to these 3 questions. You can work in groups. Just if you do, put the names of everybody in your group at the top. And you'll all receive the same grade. You can work by yourself if you want. Just put only your name at the top. Type all the answers to these questions in a Microsoft Word document. Submit it on Blackboard. Once again, that's due Friday at 11:59, and I will post the place where you can turn it in on Blackboard like as soon as class is done. So that's all I've got. So I'll stop recording now. I can stick around and answer questions if people want.